This week's topic is about AM radio and how some layers of the atmosphere impact that at different times of the day and night. So we have the electromagnetic spectrum here that goes, radio waves, microwaves, infrared, visible light, all the way to X-rays and gamma rays. And radio waves, those are some of the longest frequency type of waves, and they can be the length of a football field or a lot longer than that. So their wavelengths are a lot longer. So AM radio wavelengths are about 579 to about 1,800 feet long. So these have some of the longest wavelengths in the electromagnetic spectrum, and that's how they communicate those signals that we hear as audio when we turn our dials on our radio transmitters or in our cars. So amplitude versus wavelength versus frequency. This is kind of a core concept here in order to understand how radio waves work. Amplitude is the height of the waves. So you have a low energy wave with a small amplitude versus a high energy wave with a large amplitude. The amplitude of the wave is related to the energy in which it transports. Compare that to wavelength. The wavelength of the wave is the difference between the peaks of that wave, and that correlates to the frequency. So when a wave has a long wavelength, that leads to a low frequency, compared to a short wavelength, that's a high frequency. So putting all this together, large amplitude wave here, big up and down motion there versus small amplitude. High frequency, they're very closely packed together, versus low frequency, the waves are a lot spread farther apart. So amplitude is, the radio wave is going to be quieter when the amplitude is shorter, versus it'll be louder when the amplitude is larger or taller. Lower pitch of those waves when the frequency is low or longer, versus a higher pitch when that frequency is really short. So that's kind of how waves work, especially within the radio realm of that electromagnetic spectrum. So we have to modulate those waves in order to communicate that information across long distances. AM radio stands for amplitude modulation, whereas FM radio stands for frequency modulation. So AM radio, first successful audio transmission in the 1870s, so it's a lot older than FM radio, which was developed in the 1930s in the United States. With AM, the amplitude of the waves changes, whereas the frequency remains the same, whereas with FM, the frequency changes and the amplitude stays the same. So you have AM between 535 and 1705 kilohertz, and that kind of correlates with your dial. So like KFYR radio, 550 AM, that's within that frequency. Whereas you have FM radio, that's between about 88 to 108 megahertz of that frequency. And it's more susceptible to noise, AM radio is, whereas FM radio is less susceptible to noise. So you have these radio signals which carry that audio information. It's added with a carrier signal, and that helps to carry that radio signal over long distances. The amplitude or the frequency, AM radio versus FM radio, of that carrier signal is modulated. So with AM radio, you go from your information signal, combine it with the carrier signal, and we're modulating or changing the amplitude of those waves to communicate the information. Compared to FM radio, information signal, carrier signal combined, and that FM signal has different frequencies. The waves are tightly packed together with a high frequency, whereas they're spread farther apart with a low frequency. So the wavelength difference, FM is only about 10 feet long, whereas AM radio, again, has that very long wavelength, and they both have pros and cons. AM signals can travel to more remote locations, but have that lower sound quality, whereas the FM signals can't travel that long, but they have better sound quality. So now let's relate it to the atmosphere. We have the ionosphere. That's various parts of the atmosphere. You can see on this chart here, it's within parts of the mesosphere. We're way down here, but that's about 40 to 50 miles up, all the way up to different layers. There's a F layer of the ionosphere, all the way up to about 200 plus miles above our heads. So these are regions within our atmosphere that have relatively large number of electrically charged atoms and molecules. So as the sun is putting in high energy X-rays and ultraviolet light, that's colliding with gas molecules and atoms in our upper atmosphere. Some of those collisions knock electrons free from the atoms and molecules, which creates electrically charged ions, which are atoms or molecules with missing electrons, as well as just free electrons floating around. These electrically charged ions and electrons behave and move differently than with normal neutral atoms and molecules. So radio waves travel either right along the ground, kind of in a line of sight, straight line, using tall transmission towers. You also have ground waves, which kind of follow the Earth's curvature beyond the horizon, and that's usually with the AM radio with those longer wavelengths. And they can be shot up to the sky and bounce off that electrically charged particle region, the ionosphere, with this kind of certain layer structure that we have with the ionosphere, and that's in different parts of the day. So we'll go over this here, kind of how it works day versus night with AM radio. We have the ionosphere between 40 and 250 miles above Earth's surface. It's ionized by radiation from the sun during the daytime. Here's a scale for you with the height above our heads of that ionosphere and the different layers that we have. In the daytime, you have the D layer, the E layer, and 2 parts of the F layer. Now, when we're trying to send out an AM radio wave, we're going to send that up towards the ionosphere, but it'll get absorbed by the D layer. Therefore, we're just getting the signal from our ground wave. So the AM radio is only heard within the range of the ground wave during the day. The D layer absorbs that radio signal. Now, at night, the ionosphere becomes thinner, and we have just the E layer and the F layer, and even those are a little bit smaller. This is because the ionosphere's existence is due to that radiation from the sun striking the atmosphere. All 3 layers are more dense during the day, whereas at night they decrease in density and the D layer essentially disappears. So now our AM radio waves can bounce off that ionosphere and travel up to thousands of miles away without that D layer in place. The radio waves bounce between the ionosphere and Earth, and that's called skywave propagation, or shortened to the skip. So here's kind of side by side. Day, the radio waves are absorbed by that lowest layer of the ionosphere, versus at night, they can travel very long distances because of the skip. Now, a note here, because FM signals have much shorter wavelengths and can't travel as far, they're not significantly reflected by the ionosphere. So at night, due to that skip, there would be massive interference at all if all the AM radio stations operated the same at night as they did during the day. Therefore, to avoid this, most AM stations either cease transmission or reduce power at night and just rely on that ground wave to get its signal out. So the stations with clearance to keep transmitting overnight are the ones that you can pick up if you're trying to tune that dial on your radio station and get some AM radio from pretty far away at night.